A gray dawn breaks over a flat, humid sea, and somewhere between radar blips and rushed briefings, a superpower convinces itself it is being tested. The assumption in Washington is simple. If America blinks in Southeast Asia, allies everywhere will doubt its word, and adversaries will press harder, not later, but immediately. Yet the reality on the ground is messier. A fragile government in Saigon, a growing insurgency, and a war whose edges refuse to stay contained. In that pressure, Lyndon B. Johnson faces a choice that looks like politics, sounds like strategy, and quickly becomes a machine. A congressional resolution that widens presidential power, a bombing campaign meant to signal resolve, and the first major commitment of U.S. combat troops. It is not framed as a new war. It is framed as the minimum needed to avoid humiliation, while protecting a domestic agenda he believes the country cannot afford to lose. But what was actually traded away to buy that moment of credibility? And who paid first? And how fast? Let's go inside Rooms Where History and find the turning point decision that changed the entire calculus of Vietnam. By the time Johnson inherits the presidency, Vietnam is already a problem with momentum. Under Kennedy, the U.S. expands an advisory mission and material support, trying to keep South Vietnam from collapsing without openly owning the war. Records and later reporting describe a pattern. More advisors, more equipment, more dependence, because each small reinforcement is justified as preventing a larger disaster. Yet South Vietnam's politics are unstable, and instability is not a side issue. It becomes the battlefield's foundation. Coups and leadership turnover undermine coherence in Saigon, which means Washington is not just backing an ally, it is constantly gambling on which faction can hold power long enough to fight. That instability narrows Johnson's options before he even chooses. Withdrawal risks a visible failure. Escalation risks inheriting an open-ended commitment. And the clock that matters is not only military, it is political, and it is already ticking. Johnson's central constraint is that he is trying to run two countries at once, Vietnam abroad and the Great Society at home. He wants civil rights, anti-poverty programs, and political capital to push them through, which means he cannot let Vietnam consume his presidency. Yet, he also believes he cannot be the president who loses a country under the banner of containment. The strategic culture around him treats credibility like a currency. If the U.S. retreats under pressure, commitments elsewhere may look negotiable. That belief is not just ideology, it is alliance management, reputational risk, and domestic politics collapsing into one. So Johnson's posture becomes a tightrope. Avoid a dramatic retreat that signals weakness, avoid a dramatic escalation that invites a wider war, and keep the issue quiet enough to preserve space for his domestic agenda. The problem is that Vietnam does not cooperate with quiet. The international system also constrains what victory can mean. Washington is not planning a total war against North Vietnam in the way it once fought in World War II, because leaders fear escalation could pull in China or deepen Soviet involvement. That fear shapes everything that follows. Plans are built around control, signaling, and calibrated force, not decisive invasion, which means the U.S. is not choosing between war and peace in clean terms. It is choosing among imperfect instruments meant to avoid worse outcomes. Negotiation looks politically risky if it resembles retreat. Neutralization sounds attractive, but depends on trust no one has. Withdrawal might stop the bleeding, but could trigger a credibility crisis at home and abroad. Escalation offers a third path. act hard enough to prove resolve, but limited enough to avoid great power war. On paper, that looks like a rational compromise, until events force a public test. In early 1964, the war in South Vietnam worsens, and Washington searches for leverage it can control. The military logic offered by advisors is often framed as pressure. Punish the North to change its behavior, reassure the South, convince allies the U.S. will not fold. Yet leverage depends on a credible threat, and credible threats require commitment. That is the trap forming underneath the policy debate. Because the moment Washington hints it might do more, it must decide what more actually means. Airstrikes, sustained bombing, ground troops, or all of the above. And each step changes incentives for every actor watching. Hanoi may harden rather than bend. Saigon may rely more on U.S. muscle rather than reform itself. Congress may grant authority and then demand results. The policy space shrinks because everyone's expectations expand at the same time. Then comes the Gulf of Tonkin, a moment that turns ambiguity into authorization. In early August 1964, reports from the destroyer USS Maddox and the surrounding command chain describe an attack and then, crucially, a second incident soon after that is far less clear. What matters for Johnson's decision cycle is not only what happened on the water, but how fast the event becomes a political and strategic signal. A crisis offers what policy debates rarely provide: urgency, public attention, and a claim of self-defense. The assumption that America must respond immediately and visibly begins to override quieter arguments about restraint, because if the U.S. does not respond, the story becomes weakness. If it does respond, the story becomes resolve. In that compressed space, Johnson is handed the kind of opportunity that also functions like a lock. Johnson chooses retaliation, and he chooses to formalize the authority to do more. The immediate strike is framed as measured, an answer, not an invasion. But the more durable move is political. The Tonkin Gulf Resolution, pushed through Congress as a demonstration of unity and deterrence. Mechanically, it changes the balance between deliberation and action. It expands presidential room to maneuver without the friction of repeated votes. Strategically, it broadcasts that the United States is willing to widen the conflict if challenged. Domestically, it reduces visible dissent at the moment dissent is most damaging, during an election year. The trade-off is embedded in the mechanism. When authority becomes broad, accountability becomes delayed, and policy can drift farther before the public realizes how far it has gone. The resolution is not the war, but it is the hinge that makes the war easier to build. Here is the tension Johnson is managing. He wants to look firm without committing to an openly American war. Publicly, he stresses restraint, limits, and responsibility. Privately, accounts indicate he is skeptical of optimistic forecasts, aware that Vietnam can swallow time, money, and lives. This is where the story becomes structurally dangerous, because the policy that emerges is not a single leap, but a controlled climb. Each step is justified as preventing the need for the next one. Each step also makes the next one more likely. The system begins to reward escalation because escalation keeps the credibility narrative intact. And credibility, once elevated to a strategic asset, becomes difficult to spend wisely. Leaders start spending it just to avoid losing it. The next test will not come from a speech, it will come from violence on the ground. Inside Johnson's circle, the debate is not simply hawks versus doves. It is competing fears. McNamara and Bundy tend to argue that pressure can be managed and measured. More force can produce more leverage if applied in controlled increments. Rusk emphasizes commitments and the dangers of appearing unreliable. On the other side, George Ball warns that escalation can create a trap. Once American prestige is tied to a battlefield outcome, leaders may keep paying higher prices to avoid admitting limits. This is not academic. These arguments translate into memos, options, and the tone of meetings where uncertainty must be turned into actionable orders. The key mechanism is the decision cycle itself. Small groups, short timelines, and a preference for steps that look reversible. But war has a way of turning reversible into already done. South Vietnam, meanwhile, is not a stable platform for American strategy. Saigon's leadership churn and battlefield weakness mean U.S. actions are often trying to compensate for political fragility. That creates a brutal incentive. The more the U.S. invests, the more it needs Saigon to function. When Saigon fails, the U.S. invests even more. This is how advisors become planners and planners become owners. Every report of a deteriorating situation increases pressure on Washington to do something, because doing nothing becomes indistinguishable from accepting defeat. Yet the tools Washington can deploy, air power, advisors, special units, cannot directly solve legitimacy problems in a partner government. They can suppress, punish, and buy time. Time, in turn, becomes the commodity Johnson is trying to purchase. Time for Saigon to stabilize, time for Hanoi to reconsider, time for American politics not to fracture. The next event will show how quickly time can vanish. In February 1965, an attack at Pleiku becomes a pressure spike, an incident that forces the U.S. to choose between absorbing pain or escalating punishment. The logic is immediate. If attacks produce no response, deterrence collapses. If they produce a response, the U.S. must show it can impose costs. Johnson authorizes retaliatory strikes framed as proportional. But proportionality is not only a moral concept here, it is a strategic constraint designed to avoid provoking China or the Soviets into direct confrontation. So the response is carefully shaped, which creates a second tension. If strikes are limited to avoid escalation, they may also be insufficient to change Hanoi's calculus. That means leaders may feel compelled to strike again and again to reach an effect that a limited tool cannot reliably deliver. This is how punishment becomes policy. From this point, escalation is no longer an abstract possibility. It becomes an operating system. The U.S. begins sustained bombing in the campaign known as Rolling Thunder, designed to pressure North Vietnam and signal endurance. The theory is that calibrated force can communicate a message. Stop supporting the insurgency or the costs will rise. Yet the message is complicated by the constraints. Targets are selected and restricted. Intensity is managed, and the campaign aims to be persuasive without becoming total. That sounds sophisticated, but it also introduces ambiguity. Hanoi can interpret limits as hesitancy. The insurgency can adapt by dispersing and hardening. The South can interpret U.S. air power as a substitute for political reform. Meanwhile, each new bombing order increases the political difficulty of stepping back, because stepping back would now look like losing nerve after committing. The system tightens. Bombing also changes the internal American debate because it creates metrics, sorties flown, tonnage dropped, targets hit, that look like progress even when strategy is unclear. This is one of escalation's most seductive properties. It generates activity that can be reported upward as accomplishment. But activity is not the same as leverage. If the opponent's objective is endurance and political will, then punishment may strengthen resolve rather than break it. And if Washington's objective is credibility, then the act of bombing can become proof of seriousness regardless of whether it produces the intended outcome. That is a strategic trade. The U.S. buys near-term reassurance, we are doing something, and risks long-term entanglement if something does not change reality. The next step is the one Johnson most wants to avoid: American ground combat, visible to the world. The first major U.S. combat troops arrive at Da Nang in March 1965, initially framed as protection for air bases and key installations. The phrasing matters because it is how leaders manage political perception. Defensive deployments feel limited. Offensive missions feel like a new war. But the battlefield does not respect labels. Once troops are in place, commanders must decide how to use them to reduce risk. Protection expands into patrols. Patrols expand into engagements. Engagements expand into requests for more troops to avoid being outnumbered or outmaneuvered. The mechanism is operational necessity. Commanders are responsible for outcomes on the ground, and outcomes require resources. In Washington, each request becomes a decision point, and each approval becomes a precedent. The war is now American in a way it was not before, even if the language remains careful. This is where Westmoreland enters as a decisive operational voice. His assessments and requests reflect a logic of attrition. To defeat the enemy, the U.S. must engage, disrupt, and wear down opposing forces faster than they can be replaced. That logic has a mechanical demand: more troops, more mobility, more air support, more supply. In turn, the Pentagon and Pacific Command channels translate strategic ambiguity into force packages, timetables, and deployment orders. Johnson's decision cycle, small meetings, urgent memos, controlled announcements, now produces concrete outputs measured in battalions and brigades. The trade-off becomes sharper. Escalation may prevent immediate collapse in South Vietnam and reassure allies, but it also shifts the war's center of gravity toward American political will. If American will breaks, the strategy breaks, and the price of preserving will is often to promise that success is just one more increment away. Johnson's Tuesday lunch and other closed-door sessions matter because they compress national strategy into a manageable ritual. A handful of men, a small room, a limited set of options, and a shared assumption that credibility must be protected. That ritual is efficient, and efficiency is valuable in crisis. But efficiency also narrows imagination. When the same framework is used repeatedly, pressure, response, incremental increase, policy becomes path-dependent. Leaders begin to evaluate choices not by asking, "What outcome do we want?" but by asking, "What step is politically possible next week?" That is how long wars begin without a single dramatic declaration. It is also how dissent can be structurally minimized. If the decision is framed as a sequence of small necessities, then opposing any one step can be painted as irresponsible. The question becomes not whether to escalate, but how to manage escalation's speed. In July 1965, Johnson approves a major increase in forces, moving beyond limited protection toward a large-scale American ground war. Public messaging emphasizes resolve without dramatizing the scale, because dramatizing the scale risks public backlash and threatens the domestic agenda. The trade-off here is brutally clear. The administration buys time and battlefield capacity by spending political capital in advance, committing the country to a trajectory that will be difficult to reverse without visible defeat. And once the commitment is made, every casualty, every additional request, and every setback becomes not just a military event, but a referendum on the president's judgment. This is the point where a policy designed to protect credibility starts consuming it. Because now, credibility is no longer a theory about alliances. It is tied to daily headlines and human cost. And the machinery that produces just one more increment accelerates. As U.S. operations expand, the war's logic increasingly becomes attrition and measurable output. Areas swept, enemy counted, villages secured, sorties flown. This is not because leaders are indifferent, it is because they need a way to translate chaos into governance. Yet the opponent's strategy is also about governance, political influence, intimidation, patience, and the ability to absorb punishment. That mismatch is a second-order effect of Johnson's escalation choice. The U.S. becomes deeply committed to a form of war it can execute well, while the political foundations that would make that execution decisive remain fragile. Meanwhile, Hanoi can interpret American escalation as confirmation that the U.S. has tied its identity to the conflict, which can strengthen the incentive to hold out. The war becomes a contest of endurance, and endurance is not something a memo can order into existence. Back in Washington, Vietnam begins to compete with the Great Society for attention, money, and trust. Even before the later peak years, the pattern forms: more spending abroad, harder bargaining at home, more secrecy or careful framing, more skepticism from the press and public. Johnson's original constraint, protect domestic reform, starts to invert. The very escalation meant to keep Vietnam from destroying his presidency begins to define it. And in a democracy, definition is power. As the administration commits deeper, it must justify deeper, which encourages optimistic projections, which then raise expectations, which then punish leaders when reality resists. That is not a moral failure. It is a structural consequence of incremental escalation under public scrutiny. The bargain Johnson makes is to postpone a reckoning. The cost of postponement is that when the reckoning arrives, it will be larger than it would have been earlier. Internationally, escalation triggers recalculation on every side. Allies watch whether the U.S. will absorb pain to keep commitments. Adversaries watch whether the U.S. will accept limits or double down. The Soviet Union and China each have their own incentives, supporting North Vietnam without inviting a direct superpower confrontation. And those incentives shape the flow of aid and the boundaries of risk. This is one reason Johnson's limited approach persists. Leaders fear that an all-out blow could transform a regional conflict into a wider war. But limitation has a cost. If the opponent believes the U.S. is self-restrained, then time becomes the opponent's ally. So the U.S. is stuck between two dangers: strike harder and risk expansion, strike softer and risk ineffectiveness. That dilemma is not solved by willpower. It is the geometry of the decision Johnson set in motion. By late 1965, the escalation is no longer a hypothesis. It is an established reality with its own inertia. U.S. troop levels rise dramatically, bombing continues, and the administration is now invested in proving that escalation can produce results. This is the crucial psychological trade-off. Once leaders claim that more commitment will yield stability, they must protect that claim to protect their authority. And the enemy has incentives to challenge it, because challenging it imposes political cost even if battlefield cost is high. This is how the conflict becomes not only a war in Vietnam, but a war over American credibility at home. Johnson's decision after Tonkin bought him short-term unity and operational flexibility. It also reduced the number of clean exits later, because exits begin to look like admissions. And admissions become politically dangerous for the very domestic agenda he wanted to preserve. So, what did Johnson's turning point decision achieve in the short term? It stabilized a narrative. It reassured allies that U.S. commitments were not empty. It signaled to adversaries that the U.S. would absorb risk rather than retreat under pressure. It also kept South Vietnam from facing abandonment at the moment Washington believed abandonment could unravel containment credibility globally. Those are real objectives, and they explain why escalation felt, inside the decision room, like the responsible option. But the same mechanism that delivered those gains also created vulnerabilities. By expanding authority and committing forces in increments, the U.S. built a policy that could grow faster than its political consensus. By choosing a limited war with high visibility, the administration tied success to public patience, an asset that cannot be requisitioned like equipment. And by emphasizing credibility, it made it harder to admit uncertainty, even when uncertainty was the most honest assessment. Johnson's escalation after the Gulf of Tonkin shows how a single turning point decision can be simultaneously strategic and trapping. In the short run, it achieved what it was designed to achieve. It projected resolve, preserved a reputation for commitment, and bought time for a shaky partner government while the Cold War still punished visible retreats. But it also damaged something less visible and more precious: the margin for reversal. The price was paid in many currencies at once: expanded executive authority that reduced friction before the public could fully evaluate the path, a growing gap between operational metrics and political reality, a domestic agenda gradually crowded by a war that demanded more attention the longer it lasted, and, most of all, the transformation of credibility from a tool of strategy into a demand that strategy must serve. The deeper lesson is analytical, not moral. When leaders treat credibility as the primary objective, they can begin trading away flexibility, the ability to stop, pivot, or renegotiate, because flexibility looks like weakness in the moment. And once flexibility is gone, escalation can become the only move left that still feels consistent with the story leaders have promised. That is how decisions made behind closed doors can outgrow the intentions that produced them, and why consequences can't be walked back. If you found this story compelling, please take a moment to like this video. It helps Rooms Where History reach more viewers who care about calm, evidence-minded analysis rather than slogans. Subscribe if you want more documentaries built around one decision, the constraints behind it, and the long shadow it cast. And add a comment telling us where you're watching from. Our audience spans across cities, generations, and viewpoints, and thoughtful discussion is part of what keeps these histories alive. Thank you for watching, and thank you for supporting a channel that treats cause and effect as seriously as the people who once had to choose.